What's up, folks? DJ, the Bearded Bass Man, here with you. And for this video, I thought I would do a quick rundown of some rods. To be more specific, 5 rods that I think as a bass fisherman you just can't live without. Now, whether that be you're fishing on a boat in a tournament, co-angler in a tournament, or just fishing somewhere for fun. These are the 5 rods that I think every bass fisherman needs to own. Now, I'm not going to jump into models or makes, because models and makes are just like people's cars. Everybody's going to have their own preference, and everybody's going to think that their make and their model is better than someone else's. And that's really apples to oranges. Pretty much all I'm going to do is just break down technique specific and just run-of-the-mill operation rods. Now, one thing you'll notice about all the rods that I'm showing, except the exception of one, are casting rods. Now, a lot of people use spinning rods most of the time rather than casting rods. I happen to be a guy that uses casting rods opposed to spinning rods. But these rods will also work for people running spinning too. We're just, instead of having one spinning rod, which I'm about to show, their whole arsenal will be nothing but spinning rods. And that's fine. It's just personal preference. It's not the status quo, or someone has to have casting rods to be a bass fisherman. We all know that's just not the case. Jumping into that, my first rod that I think every bass fisherman needs to be equipped with is a spinning rod. Now, I use my spinning rod mostly for drop shot. It's a finesse rod. It's definitely something you're going to throw light lures on. Maybe even weightless Senkos, something along that line. Typically, your finesse rod, your spinning rod, you're going to want it to be maybe light action, light medium, or depending on what type of fish or the size your fish are going after, you might even want to go with an ultralight. The reason you want a very light action is because you're going to want a very light presentation. You use a light line, and a lot of the times you're going to be using a very small light capacity reel. For using something like this, you're going to have to use a lot of finesse. Obviously, I keep saying finesse because that's what this rod's dedicated purpose is. It's going to be finesse presentations. Length is not so much a determining factor as your action. I tend to like a little longer rod. You'll notice that with most of my arsenal here is they're mostly longer rods, mostly over 7 foot. Depending on your area or the terrain you're going to be tackling, if you're on a bank, you may want something a little shorter. This rod just happens to be a 7-1. But you're going to want to focus on your light actions. Your light actions is what's going to give your presentation and your lure movement that little sudden flick. It's kind of like with your drop shot, little movements is going to translate big when it goes into the water and actually acts upon the bait. Next up, what we're going to talk about is a crankbait rod. Now, all bass fishermen love to throw crankbaits. You've got to have a dedicated rod just for throwing crankbaits. This is going to be a lot like the spinning rod, and it's going to be very technique specific. Unlike a lot of your other rods, it's going to have a parabolic action. It's going to have a very soft tip, a very moderate action tip. You're going to want as much flex in that rod tip as you can get. The slower the action, or the more moderate the action, the more time that bass is going to have to inhale that lure, because it's going to be a moving lure. You're not going to want to rip it right out of his mouth just as soon as he gets to see what he wants to eat it. So you're definitely going to want it with a little slower tip. As far as overall action, this one right here just happens to be a medium heavy. Some people use medium, which is fine. Once again, overall length not as important as action. You're going to see that is a trim that I keep with all of my rods, is not so much length being an important factor, but action. I'm looking for the overall action of the rod to be consistent all my specific techniques. As I said, the crankbait rods, you want that real slow action tip, that very parabolic, because you're going to want that fish to have that much more time in snatching up that bait that's moving through the water. Now, the next rod we're going to talk about is going to be a topwater rod. Normally your topwater rod is going to have a lot of similar characteristics with your crankbait rod. It's going to have a much slower action as opposed to a worm rod or a flipping stick or something like that. It's going to have that parabolic action that your crankbait rod shares. Most typically a topwater rod is going to be a little shorter. Now, I'm not a terribly tall fella, so this is actually my shortest rod, which is 6'6". Some people use 6'8", 6'10", and even some people will use all the way up to a 7 foot, 7'2". The reason length becomes an issue with this one is I use this one primarily for jerkbaits. Now, when you're throwing a jerkbait, if you're on a boat or if you're on the bank, you're going to be doing the pop, pop, pause, pop, pop, pause. When you're doing that, you're going to be flicking the tip of your rod down. Now, if you're in a boat, that's going to translate into slamming your tip of your rod into the gunnel of your boat if it's a very long rod, or the bank if you're on the bank. The reason you want a shorter rod is because you get away with those movements, those downward little taps or downward thrusts or slashes or whatever you want to call them, and you won't be smacking the tip of your rod off of the ground or the gunnel of your boat. Now, the fourth rod we're going to talk about is actually the rod that I have in my hands most often, and that rod would be a worm rod. Your worm rod's main purpose is going to be exactly what its name details: throwing worms, throwing soft plastics, whether that be on a Texas rig or a Carolina rig. You could be throwing a jig, but we have another one in store for that. So let's, for all intents and purposes, let's say this one's going to be throwing nothing but soft plastics. The action on these can vary extremely. This one just happens to be a medium because it's a finesse rod. As I am a finesse guy, I have a worm rod that reflects that. People use anywhere from medium to medium heavy to extra heavy for their worm rods. These rods tend to be a little longer than most, anywhere from 6'9" all the way up to 7'6". Now, these are going to be your utilitarian rods. These ones are going to be built to withstand a little bit, if not more, pressure than most rods. They're going to be a little more beefy. As I said, this one's a medium, so it's not. But it's going to have a very fast tip. It's going to have a tip that's very sensitive, with a lot of backbone leading up into maybe a 20% tip or even a 30% tip. You're going to want a meaty backbone because you're trying to drive a worm hook, a single hook, into the fish's mouth, so you're going to want as much backbone as you can possibly get to actually get that hook set. You're going to want the light tip, obviously, to fill whatever bites you may be ticking along the bottom, or when a fish very lightly picks up and runs with the worm. And last but not least, our fifth rod we're going to talk about is a rod that every bass fisherman in the nation has definitely got some version of this in his boat. That rod being the beef stick of all rods, and that would be the flipping stick or the pitching stick. Most of the time this is throwing a very large lure. It's throwing either a big jig or possibly a punching setup. It's throwing something that has got a lot of girth to it, a lot of size to it. And because of that, its action is definitely going to reflect that. This one isn't actually an extra heavy, so it's pretty much just a broomstick with some guides on it. It has, once again, just like the worm rod, a very fast, sensitive tip, but it has a bunch of backbone. This rod needs to be able to drag fish out of some gnarly stuff. This is pretty much going to be the bulldozer, if you will, of your rod arsenal. It's going to be the biggest thing that you probably have if you're down to these 5 selections. And the reason being that is you're throwing big things. You're throwing big baits, whether that be a jig or, as I said, a punching rig, something with a lot of weight. And you're most of the time going to be throwing it into gnarly stuff. So when you get that hit, you're going to need every ounce of leverage you can to rip that fish up out of that cover. Not to mention the hook set in itself. A lot of the jigs that you're going to be throwing are heavy wire jig hooks, so you're going to want as much power and as much leverage as you can possibly get to get that hook set sent home. Lengths are going to be very large. This one is actually a 7'6". Some flipping sticks even go up to 8'8", even 9 foot. These are going to be, as I said, the brutes of all fishing rod setups. It's definitely the brute of mine. Alright folks, that pretty much wraps this video up. I hope you enjoyed my little rundown and description of what I think the most important rods in a bass fisherman's arsenal is. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to throw them down in the comment section below. And as I said, I tried not to jump into makes and models very much, but in case you're wondering what I'm running, I will definitely put that down in the description below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, I'm the Bearded Bassman saying thanks for watching.